Pico, and you're watching Thorin's YouTube.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Daring Minds. And on this one, look, I'll be honest, on some of the shows before, if you can sort of figure out who these people are and their relation to me, I did obviously just abuse contacts and people I know as like friends early on. I might have just presented them as players in Valorant, but they were just low-key people who just would have said yes. Then I later did go for some big names. Now, you might think this is setting up to be some epic diss, but it's actually not, because if people don't know, one of the reasons why my shows will always have a unique appeal in terms of conversations is I'm not a star fucker. I don't only just go off like the biggest name possible, invite them and hope fans tune in, because that's not always the best convo, actually. What I actually like to do as well, and I've done it throughout all my shows too, CSGO, League of Legends, all the shows going back years and years, is I also like to take people I just see in the community who have interesting thoughts, or they put in work to do content, etc. That's how I do the show with Gio. Basically, I just like to bring those people in and have interesting convos with them, see how it goes, see what it could. Also, by the way, bonus is you can also say things people who are on that camera maybe can't. Maybe they're worried that they get fired or not hired if you say an opinion about a team. Could be Sentinels, could be anyone really, right? Could be anyone. So anyway, elevated here is someone who you might know. He runs the YouTube channel Valorant Ascended, where he does a mixture of like casual stuff about just the champions and ages, but he also does like rod reviews of the top teams playing in VCT and stuff. He actually comes from Dota, as he alluded to before, where he was initially working with Liquipedia, so he's obviously a nerd, he's in those Wikipedias like we all are, and he actually obviously low-key early on wanted to be an analyst in Dota too, but that didn't work out, and here he is in Valorant. Not a bad summation, right?
That's a really well-rounded way of saying this guy is a nobody.
Hey, at least my mom said I was special, so I'll go.
I got dragged into it too. He was like, "Oh, that's why I do a show with Gio." Cool, thanks.
It's all right.
It's all right. Over there.
Here's the thing: he does have 80k subs on his YouTube, so
all right, that's more than me.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. That's great. You got to give him that one. Okay, right. Here's where I want to start. Sure. Right, obviously, what we'll do on this episode generally is I thought as a skeleton, we'll just start talking about some of the results, some of the teams in VCT NA, and then from there, as usual, we'll find cool, interesting sidebars and topics and tangents, and we'll digress off into all sorts of abstract things and specific things about specific players. So if we just start out here, right, one thing I wanted to ask you about in Valorant at the moment is, we touched on this in our last episode, right? The problem at the moment is, it's like the fucking classic movie The Highlander. There's a quickening coming where they are going to suddenly go from a million orgs in NA trying to be in Valorant and we want to be the best to like obviously who is going to make it through the fucking like the cheese grater of what like the franchising system's going to be and who gets in. Well, we're already basically seeing like the initial things of that, because like I have to say, when I saw that news elevated that was like Luminosity's just out of the game, when last VCT they were one of the teams in position to potentially be going to the LAN itself. Like that implies to me there is going to be a bit of a move and shake, and in fact I get the vibe this and the next of the VCTs, these are it. Like, you have to show something now if you want to make it through and be with the big orgs. Do you get a similar vibe?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really interesting about the ecosystem, I mean, coming from Dota, as you mentioned, like, there's like no orgs in North America, so it's kind of been very interesting to see everybody involved in Valorant. And it makes sense, obviously, new game. Riot has a history of being successful in esports. But it's pretty clear that, like you said, it's going to be like a culling. Like there's going to be a lot of teams, and teams that have had good results. I mean, I'm thinking of teams like Knights. Like they seem to be very much on the chopping block, despite being very good over the last year and a half and consistently improving. But there's just like not enough clout and not enough results. It's either you're either like very, very popular or you have won something. And this is kind of like not talking about NA, but I thought it's interesting to maybe look at somebody like Ascend from EMEA, where it's like, this is a brand new org that has like no history, but they won champions. So pretty likely that they're going to get a slot, because it'd be really weird to not have a world champion in your first franchising system, despite them being a little bit smaller than, the G2s and that kind of stuff.
Sure. What do you think, Gio? Do you get this vibe that there's sort of a change coming potentially?
So, I mean, the whole Luminosity thing in particular really kind of piqued my interest, because as someone who's come from Rainbow Six, anyone from Rainbow Six will remember that Luminosity's exit from Rainbow Six was quite egregious. Like, it was really not great.
Okay, what happened?
It was basically them deciding that they did not want to invest in the scene anymore. And there was a whole, I mean, it was a couple of years ago now. There was a whole thing, because Luminosity and Evil Geniuses exited Rainbow Six at the same time, but there was a lot of credit given to Evil Geniuses for the fact that they at least communicated with their players. And that was the whole thing with Luminosity was that they didn't necessarily communicate with their players, and their players were kind of left high and dry without an org.
Oh, was it one of those things where you wake up and you find out on Twitter you're fired or something? Was it like that?
That's definitely the vibe that it appears. As an outsider, like obviously, like I'm a third person, I'm a third party in this whole thing, but like that's definitely what it seemed.
Right.
And yeah, Luminosity definitely have, at least in like the path I've taken in esports, set this sort of track record as being the org who is okay with dipping out at the point at which they decide it's not financially viable for them anymore. And that's understandable from the perspective of like, yeah, esports sometimes isn't financially viable.
Sure.
I don't know what talks Luminosity are having with Riot in the background, or if Luminosity have been rejected by Riot for being part of their new franchise league. I am not privy to any of that. But what I will say is that as someone who is very familiar with the Rainbow Six scene, I've seen this from Luminosity before. So it sort of didn't really surprise me. As shitty as that is to say, it's sort of like I've heard this song, you know?
Yes. It's funny you say that because it makes me wonder, because actually Luminosity is a good example, because if people don't know, they are a known brand in esports. Like obviously famously they got their start with the CSGO team like in 2016, and that team became number one. They'd won the major, right? But if people don't know, what happened was they didn't technically kick their players. Their players actually left, and like their contractors sort of ended. It was a complicated scenario where they had like, essentially they'd signed like, you know, a pre-agreement to do another contract, but they hadn't signed the other contract. And so you were in this weird legal limbo space. And basically, I'll tell you the real scoop of what happened, but publicly it was that they just left to SK Gaming. Really what happened was SK Gaming were way bigger org in Counter-Strike, came along and were willing to invest to get the number one team and said, like, right, we'll give you all these mega salaries. And the only real drama was Luminosity sort of found out about this. Actually, this is them getting scooped. They only found out last minute, like all the players just told them, like, yeah, we're leaving to this other org, basically. So they tried to scramble and be like, well, since we've got the number one team, like I heard behind the scenes, they went and they tried to get like bigger sponsors and told them like, look, if we can sign this team to like this kind of salaries, they'll stay and they'll be on our brand. But it didn't work, right? So the problem is in CSGO they lost a mega team and they were never relevant again. They were like they went back down essentially and tried to find another team. So another Brazilian team, it was just okay at that point. It was never like a top 10, top 20 team. Then after that, you have this team in Rainbow Six. Now you have the one in Valorant. The reason I use them as an example is because they're exactly the org. Like Elevated says, I feel like it's in trouble because you, like he says, the two main ways you're going to get into a franchise system is either you're like Cloud9, you're like some super massive org that everyone wants to work with and is going to be here a long time. So essentially, you've nailed the business part, or you better be fucking amazing at the game. You better be like a world champ. You better be essentially, even though now it's a terrible example, last year the example would be Gambit. Gambit's a tiny org, but if your team's that good, mate, they'll find a way to let you in. The problem with the Luminosities of the world is they're in the middle spot, aren't they? It's like they can have a pretty good team, but not the best, and they're not quite popular enough necessarily that it's worth just staying in just for the marking. I feel like those are the teams, to me, are logical. They get squeezed out. It's why actually this whole process I'm going to find very interesting, because I would assume the reason the Luminosities of the world get good in these games is because it's basically how the industry works. Because when the newer esports start to get a little bit of hype, they haven't fully maxed out the salaries and they haven't made like all the money ridiculous. So what you do 100%. If you're an org like Luminosity is, instead of trying to compete in CSGO, you ask yourself, like, is there a smaller esport? Could be a Rocket League or something a few years ago. You say, is there a game where I can spend the same money, but I can get like the world champion? I can be like number one in that game, so I have something to sell to my sponsors. The problem becomes when these games expand, you're back at square one again. And suddenly the game's too big for you and you have to sort of go elsewhere or be a bottom feeder. It's actually a really tough spot, I feel, for the orgs, because as Gio says, most of them are losing money on this. It's essentially a gamble on the future. In fact, most Valorant orgs essentially the last few years probably gambled to get into franchising. That was what they were putting all the money in for.
I mean, that's
none of them are profitable, right?
No, yeah, absolutely.
No.
Like, that's definitely true. As soon as, and this is a very interesting conversation to have with people who don't work in esports, is about, like, you know, a lot of people are anti-franchising, and it's like, yeah, it's not ideal, but like, if you want esports to exist, it's probably going to franchising is going to have to be there in some extent. But like, Luminosity specifically, I don't remember the name of their parent company, but their parent company. Oh, is that it?
Enthusiast Gaming, yeah.
I remember after the whole like shit with what happened in Rainbow Six, a friend and I, like, all of their finances are public information.
Right.
You can go look it all up. And it's such a small portion of what they spend is actually on the esport itself and on the team salary and on everything like that. Like,
is everything else like the streamers and stuff, I'm guessing?
Well,
right?
It was like they're an entertainment company first and foremost. So it's like whatever all the other shit was. I don't remember. It was a long time ago when I actually went and like looked at this stuff. But it's like, I can understand that if that's just like an extra expenditure, like I can totally get that. And also you have to consider that Luminosity are tied into at least one franchise league because they work with the Canucks Sports and Entertainment for the Vancouver Titans brand in Overwatch.
Oh, right.
I think they also have the Seattle Surge in Call of Duty, but I could be wrong on that.
Okay.
But I know for a fact that they're with the Canucks for the brand in Overwatch because I mean the whole thing when like they pick their colors and stuff at the beginning, but also like the Vancouver Canucks are my hockey team, so I'm very familiar with like their business things that they do. And so I know that they are in a very expensive franchise system right now. And so I can totally understand why they would maybe be a bit more picky with their esports expenses outside of that, especially if things are not necessarily guaranteed for them. And that's the whole situation that is in Valorant right now, where it's like Valorant as an esport is in a really healthy place because it's so popular and people really love it. The franchise system is going to be coming in next year. It's been set up specifically so that Riot basically get total control over who they're going to pick to be in the system, which I think is a very smart way of doing it from Riot's perspective.
Sure.
But it still means that if you are a team that does not have a definite, like, top, let's say 4 global team, like there's going to be some sweat running down your back, right? Because you don't know if you're going to be picked by Riot to be in the team. And I don't know what streamers Luminosity have. I don't know anything like that. I don't really know a lot about what they do to invest in the scene outside of literally just paying 5 salaries. And with a lot of teams clamoring over themselves to be in the scene, like you just suggested, Duncan, is, you know, you've got a lot to compete with because a lot of franchise systems are going to want to see proof that you are investing in their scene beyond just like having a team.
Yes.
And in Valorant right now, I think that that's probably quite competitive.
Yeah, I mean, I think one other thing that's kind of interesting about Luminosity is it seems pretty clear that like the parent organization is very like splashy, but also kind of quick to make moves. Because I believe that they also like, I mean, they spent a ton of money to build Upcomer and then just like immediately fired everybody. And like, transitioned it from like being a journalistic website to like video content.
Yes.
And then like
it only lasted like a year and a half or something,
Yeah.
It wasn't long,
Yeah.
And I mean I don't want to speculate too much.
No,
like,
sure.
Let's also remember that they had XQC signed to their org and they had Ninja. It's like 2 of the like literally the biggest streamers.
Yeah,
in the
these are
entire
people
world.
you're paying millions, by the way. Like, you're paying enormous amounts. Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, I don't know what's going on over there, but it's not worked out very smoothly, I guess.
Sure. Right, what about this? Because one thing I thought was quite interesting was, since there's been a bunch of roster moves and stuff, I want to get people's like vibe on where the actual best teams are. Because I feel like the rankings that people have had the last few months, especially from the last VCT, are just irrelevant now. Like it's a totally new world if you look at all the squads. So what about this then? One team we've barely talked about on this show, just because they were going through the whole transition with bringing in DDK and Sean Gedd stuff, was obviously the Luminosity, the 100 Thieves team rather, because A, they didn't have a lineup, and then B, no one knew if they'd be good, no one even knew if they'd qualify for VCT, but they're here now, and it seems like they're actually building some hype. So Elevated, what do you think roughly of the 100 Thieves team? I think, for example, can they be the best NA team, do you think?
I don't think they're quite there to be able to like knock Optic off the top of it, but I really think that they could compete for that second slot. They're a team that to me has looked like they benefit very heavily from the structure of this group stage where you get a week between your games, because when you have this coaching staff that involves, you know, Mike's and DDK and Sean, like that's a lot of brain power to work on like just counter-stratting a team and breaking down everything. And it showed like pretty heavily, I think, in a lot of their games where they just like absolutely blast people on their map picks. They come up with some like really weird, innovative strategies that look really good. And, you know, aside from like they're kind of stumbled at TSM, which was a very strange loss, in my opinion. They've looked really good against basically every other team that they've played. And just the improvement from week to week has been really apparent, which means that, you know, going into the playoffs, they should make another jump. The only problem that I have with them is that they are kind of a young, inexperienced team where I come from like a traditional sports background where I played like in college and stuff like that. And I know what pressure feels like when
you played baseball, right?
Yeah. And the pressure of like having one game to either like end your season or, you know, go for a big tournament is it's going to make you play way differently. And a lot of these players have not been proven. You know, Asuna has performed on stage, but a lot of the other players are like, you know, facing their first really serious challenge, it seems like. And also, you kind of have to factor in the weight of like playing for 100 Thieves. You know, this is an org that is not afraid to like spend hundreds of thousands of dollars bringing in players, cutting people very quickly, making big sweeping changes. So, you know, if you're like a 19, 20-year-old kid and that's like playing in the back of your mind a little bit as you're playing the game, you're going to have some problems. So I think they have very high potential, but I do think that the experience thing is going to be a very big determining factor about how they perform in the playoffs.
I think it's very important that they have made it to playoffs, because I totally agree with you about the whole point about like the pressure that comes with playing for an org that have a proven track record of just cutting people. And that's the thing that if I were in the shoes of the players who are playing for the team right now, I would be shit scared of, because Nadeshot has done it multiple times at this point in 2022.
They've even done it like rotating door style, haven't they? They don't even just cut the whole team. They cut sort of one at a time.
Kind of. My hope, and obviously I don't know because I don't really know what goes on behind the scenes, but my hope is that 100 Thieves are pretty much know that they're going to get into the franchise league and therefore don't need to panic so much about staying in the game. That is my hope, and therefore like there may be a little bit more sort of, comfort in that. But also the fact that they've done pretty well this stage. I mean, you mentioned that their loss to TSM was a little bit peculiar. They beat XSET, who came top of their group, but then they also lost to Ghost. So the fact that they are third behind those two teams does kind of make sense. You know, it almost feels like they're in their, let's say, rightful place. They've made it to the playoffs. They are working on some consistent trajectory. They haven't changed their roster halfway through the stage, which is a nice thing. Yeah, right, a nice thing to go with. And I think that there is a lot of, not even just from the org, but also culturally in the scene, a lot of trust in particularly what Sean can do as a coach, right? And I think that brings kind of a new environment, at least from what it appears to be externally, and I would assume internally as well. And yeah, sure, like going through the playoffs and facing a team that's not in their group, it's going to be a new thing to face. They're going to be going against FaZe Clan for their first game, and then assuming they win that, they'll be going against XSET again. And so it's going to be really about like adapting rather than like showing new things necessarily. But I think the really big thing with 100 Thieves is like, if we go back to what some of the major criticisms were about this team previously, a lot of them were just about like people were on uncomfortable roles. Like they wanted to play around Asuna, but like Asuna is not an opper. Asuna is a rifler. And yet he was being forced to be in this op role because no one else that was in the team could fill that role. And so there was already this feeling of discomfort surrounding this team, and coming into this stage, there was this knowledge that that was part of what was aiming to be fixed by the team, and to have, Sean, Mike's, DDK as the manager, like there was this kind of backroom stuff, reshuffling as well to go with that. You kind of wanted to believe that this was going to be what they commit to. And the fact that it has shown results for me almost makes me feel relieved for these, as you say, kids who've come into this game come into this team, knowing that they're now playing for an organization who has been ruthless in their decision making. It's like knowing that they've made it to playoffs makes me feel relieved for their sake.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I really do think that the role thing was like the biggest problem with the 100 Thieves teams in the past. And this one definitely feels the most comfortable for everybody, I think, that's playing on the team, which is it's like unbelievably important in this game. You know, if you're a CSGO fan, I'm not a huge CSGO watcher, but like the role thing is like unbelievably important in like MOBA games and like Overwatch and Valorant. And so if you can just focus on like, setting up your teammates every single round, you have a lot less brain power to think about like communication and the calls and like the macro strategy, because some of the mechanic stuff is a little bit more natural and like muscle memory. And so that's definitely really important with this team. I think that the FaZe matchup is actually maybe the best matchup that we could have for 100 Thieves in the first round, because FaZe is a team that has these like absurd peaks and troughs in their performance, and they're a team that plays insanely aggressively. So it's going to be the perfect litmus test for 100 Thieves, because if they can withstand the pressure of Baby Bay and Dicey literally just like running at your face every single round and potentially dropping 30, 40 kills on a map, If you can withstand that and beat them, then suddenly that's a big confidence boost because you can kind of handle a style that's not your style, and then you're going to go up against a team like XSET in the next round. It's a little bit more by the book, I guess, is what I would call XSET. And
it's known quantity.
Yeah, exactly.
By the way, one thing I wanted to ask Gio is, in Valorant, is it also the case, because as you're saying about like swapping around even like the main weapon you rifle, you main rather, is it the case that like oppers are all just oppers permanently? Because in CSGO essentially, like that's a role where plenty of people, like if you have to cut a player, you might temporarily have a player take over the op, but like they're just going to get destroyed by all the best oppers because it's one of those roles, because it's such a binary weapon. It's like if you're not quite as good as like the top 10 players in the world at that role, you're just going to get eaten alive. So it's generally a role, a bit like IGL, where temporarily people swap, but usually it's advised you don't do that. Yeah, you need to either commit to beat you just that player from now on, or you just do it and you get another player in the spot.
I think if you're lucky, you'll have 2 people on the team who can do it.
Right.
But I don't think that's like the norm or something that can necessarily be relied upon for most teams. I think in most cases, you're going to have one person on the team that everybody understands that they are the primary person for that role. And there may be certain instances or certain comps that you're running or whatever where actually you flex someone else into it, kind of like what you were just saying, like you might flex someone else into an IGL role, but it's not a permanent thing.
Yes.
There are some teams where it's like, cool, we have 2 people who can do this role. That's 6. So we have that. And they may have different styles of opping as well. It might be like one person's a really aggressive opper and they're used to playing like Jet or whatever. One person is used to playing Chamber and they've come off of a Sentinel role and therefore they play a more passive opper. And we use what we need to use in that instance. But for the most part, yes, I would say that the opper has to be somebody who is specifically expected to excel in that role and is good at it. And that is one of the problems that 100 Thieves had, is that Asuna was being put into that role and expected to op because he was their Jet player. There was no one else on the team who was necessarily qualified to be an opper. And that's just not what Asuna's built for. It's not that he was a bad opper, but he wasn't good enough to go up against the other oppers in NA. Like, you put 100 Thieves against Optic, like, Ye is gonna beat him like 99 times out of 100 in those, in those 1v1s. So like, yes. I think that's the thing, is like, he can be a good opper, but is he a good enough opper? And that's what you need. You need that person on your team who is the good enough opper, who can take those duels and is expected to. And that's the problem 100 Thieves had.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think, Elevated?
I definitely think that as far as like weapon roles go, the op is really kind of the only one. Everybody else is just like rifling. We have a few like judge specialists, I guess, here and there, but the op is definitely one of those things where it's like it's been very clear, and we saw it from the beginning of the game with the supremacy of Jet. It's like you have to have an op, because if you have an op, you have so much more control over what happens in a round. And so the teams that have that op that is able to like take over a round just have one extra tool that other teams don't. You could have like insane hits, you could have really, really good utility usage, but if you have the ability to start a round 4v5, like 30-40% of the time. It's so
important for entry.
Yeah. And even now, like the way that people are playing the op, like Ye, for example, is very, very consistently entering sites with the op. And we're starting to see other players starting to do this too, where it's like he literally will. I think about Fracture stairs a lot, where he like walks up the stairs and he's just clearing every angle with the op, and he's the first person in, and he's like taking the first shot, taking the second shot, and then other people are entering. And if you have somebody that's confident enough to do that and can play the Chamber or the Jet, whichever one is doing it on a map, it's just like such an insane advantage. I asked a question on Twitter like a week or two ago where I was like, what role would you like try to find? There's actually a combo
I wanted to segue into, by the way. So I was going to ask you about right now. So let's do it. Basically, since he's obviously a guy, if you don't know Gio, since he comes from Dota, in Dota, it's like, even though the game's like League, they actually have their own system for how you order the roles. And it's in theory based on what farm you get. But actually, if you look historically, the roles don't work just by the farm. Like, actually, you wouldn't build a team like in order like that. Like, for example, the interesting thing in Dota I've noticed is the greatest teams of all time tend to actually, the common piece is the fucking 5 support plates, like the IGL essentially, the in-game game leader. Meanwhile, actually in Dota, it seems like you can pick up the superstar player, the equivalent of your star AWPer. You can pick these guys up 10 a penny in all the pubs, the guys with the 8k MMR. So it's actually a bit opposite to CSGO. Like in CSGO, you'd want simple first, wouldn't you? The absolute best player. Like, if people don't know, Na'Vi, when they were number one, had the best player in the world. They didn't even have someone we believe is an IGL. They just didn't need to because they had the best player and they could build the team a bit differently. So when you put that question out there, Elevated, you were doing it as like an open-ended question, essentially to spark like an interesting discussion, right? I noticed you tagged in a mix of like CS people, other games. So give me your initial thoughts on this. If we think of the roles, you put them out like this. You put your order as you think main initiator is the number one guy you'd want to hire. Then you put primary AWP / duelist. Anchor is third. Primary smoker is fourth, and then you put second duelist / second initiator as second, right? Give us just the basic premise of that, and then let's get Gio in. Let's have a discussion about it. I thought it was an interesting topic.
Yeah.
Why do you order it like that?
And also, just like to be clear, I'm not including IGL because that totally biases things.
Right.
Because
Okay.
IGL is such an important role. So it's like IGL is probably number one no matter what.
Seems like it is in Valorant. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But the reason I put initiator first is because I think the difference between like the elite Sova players and everybody else is like a massive gap in terms of like the impact that the Sova has. You think about like a Trent, you think about like a Crashies, the players that are not only setting all of their teammates up with incredible utility, but also are fragging out themselves, whether it's with Shock Darts or Hunter's Fury. Like the ability that Sova has to change around by simply like finding out where people are is just like unprecedented in a tactical shooter. And so I think the people that play the Sova better than other people are just more valuable, and you can find like an insane jet in a pub, but you can't really find an insane Sova player.
That's the 8k MMR player, right?
Yeah,
sure, yes,
exactly. And you know the Sova is now starting to transition a little bit into like the KOs and the fades and that kind of stuff, but even those have this very, very high ceiling of impact. So that was why I put them as number one. Number two is the op, just because of like the the CNED, like these players where you have the player that is just clearly better than everybody else in the region on the operator role, and they just win their team like, I don't know, 6 rounds a map or something like that. And that's just something you can't really replace. It's like the superstar factor, where I was like debating, is like, okay, is it more important to be able to control the map with like smokes, or is it more important to be able to just like win your team like 4 or 5 rounds a map? It's probably more important to just like have those pop off rounds. Yes. So that's why I put the primary opera there. Then the smokes, I think, was number 3. And the reason for that is because we've started to see like these lurking smoke players have like insane impact. Think about like Marv, Xander, Nats, obviously was sort of like the OG controller. Also Sentinel / controller, but at the same time, it's like if you have somebody that excels at fragging and impact in a role that is known for not having impact, then
they're going to be OP as fuck. Yeah,
it's going to be really, really strong. Yes. Yeah. And so then number 4 was like the anchor, which is like the Sentinel player, because if you can stack a site and gamble stuff and allow somebody to still somehow win you the round by getting 2 or 3 when their site gets hit. Again, that's just one of those sort of like X factors that you can't really account for when you're just like looking at normal stats on the post-game scoreboard. So, thinking about somebody, again, like a Marv or a Xander who played sort of like the smoke / anchor role. And there's a little bit of crossover, obviously, between these. You noticed I didn't say like duelist Sentinel, because I think that the roles that Riot has decided are kind of bullshit. Like it's not actually how the game works. And then finally, the secondary duelist, it's like, just find somebody who can shoot heads, put them on KO, and it's probably going to be okay most of the time.
Yes. Oh, by the way, we actually did touch on that in a past episode as well. I think most people who have followed the game at a high level agree. Like, it's not like League of Legends. It's not really like 5 roles and you need 1 of each. Like, spoiler, in CSGO it isn't like that either. Like, we have roles that we say like that to describe, but it's like, my analogy is basketball. Like, in basketball, when you have the 5 roles, most teams don't really have a center in the modern day, for example. Tons of players are really just a shooting guard. Like, really, that's more just like a very simplistic model of the game. And then within that, it's just a way to explain to someone how I set my team up. So if my team's loads of small ball, I don't really have a fucking power forward doing it. You know what I mean? Like, so Gio, what are your thoughts on this? Obviously, it's a really open-ended question, but do you have a sense of what you think the most valuable roles are for a team?
It's interesting because I think it's meta dependent, because in the meta that dominated stage 1, I would have probably said the smoke player was the most important. But in the current meta, I can totally understand why you may not think the smoke player is the most important. I probably don't either, because there's a lot more flexibility in the current meta. It's a lot faster and it allows for a lot more stylisticness. I don't know if that's a word, but like it sort of allows for you to pick your strengths and play at them. And I think that in a meta like that, an initiator is, or at least a good initiator, is always going to be universally important, because the initiator is the only person really who can gather offensive preemptive information. So like the Sentinel can gather information throughout the course of the map and can gather a lot of defensive information. But the person who can have a one-up on the info that will allow you to make any kind of engagement, whether it's the first engagement in the game or not, that is, if you have someone who's very good at that, that's always going to give you an advantage. Because as with any first-person shooter, and I mean, this is, I suppose to an extent true in MOBAs, but maybe not quite in the same way, because there are still respawns available in them. But in especially first-person shooter, like getting the opening kill is massive as a statistical advantage for you getting around.
Historically, in Counter-Strike, the stats usually something like 75% of the time you win the round if you get the opening kill.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's ridiculous. So I think having someone, at least right now, who can have an advantage in being able to get information that facilitates that is unbeatable. I find it really interesting with the other stuff, because yes, putting op second, I think is probably something I would agree with. Like, I would either put it second or third, and the other role that I would contend that with is the anchor, which is what you've put in third. So like I'm kind of along the right lines. The reason that I say that is because yes, the person who's really highly mechanically skilled, who can just pop off and whatever, can be so influential on the way that the game goes. But I think in Valorant, and I'm sure there is a similar thing in CS, but again, I don't really know much about CS, so is that your control over a post plant is super, super influential in how things go in Valorant. And I think, therefore, your anchor, i.e. the person who's guarding the site and holding a site, how they play can really make a difference in how something like a post plant goes. But I think that so much of the round, like the mid round, because that's a very late round sort of consideration.
When you say that, by the way, like people won't know what you mean by that. I presume you mean, like, for example, if they can delay the opponent getting onto the site, if they can take one extra guy,
I mean, all sorts of things like
utility
that.
and stuff,
whether
right?
It's like delaying the opponent getting onto the site, being able to provide information to the rest of your team so that they can rotate, and delaying that time. Yes. But also, if the enemy team manages to get a plant down, and you need to come up with a strategy to be able to actually get a defuse on the spike, right? Because like you need to hold back everybody else. And I think the person who has the most information about the very site on which that happens is a very important person in that. But it is very specific to the like the late round. Whereas like the opper, the star player, let's say, can have influence on almost any part of the round that can be very like pivotal. So whether that's them getting the opening kill, whether it's them like holding mid in the mid round and they get a kill then that opens up certain space, whether it's that a post plant has begun and they manage to pick off someone who is holding a really important part of the site. So maybe I would go for the opper second, just because there are more points in a round in which maybe they have such a massive influence, whereas like an anchor maybe feels a little bit more specific.
And then there's attack also, right? Like the op can also impact attack, whereas anchor's a little bit more defensive.
Yes, I mean it kind of, when I say post plant, I mean ambiguously in terms of both attack and defense. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Right, that was what confused me. I thought you just meant, because we use anchor usually just for the CT position in Counter-Strike. I thought you meant what the person defending meant, but you meant also the guy who's sort of like lurking. Yeah, he's going to be the one who comes in for the clutch, right? For the post plant. Right, I see what you mean.
I think that's the interesting thing about the anchor role as well, right? Because an anchor could be like, let's say, a smoke player who, when you're on the CT side, is like holding a site, right? But it could also be like what you often see, especially on the T side, is there's going to be a sentinel, and they are the person who's on the other side of the map, lurking on a site. So that is not necessarily role specific, and that comes back to that argument about whether or not these definitions fit within the Riot defined roles that we actually have in the game, because not necessarily they are always applicable to specific roles or whatever. And then that's why the argument about Nats, for example, Nats, who was considered for a long time potentially the best player in the world, mostly picked Sentinel roles, at least at the time, and it's because he redefined the way of lurking, and that is a T-side sort of way of playing, right? So I think that can be very influential, but I think that the op role is probably more universal, so maybe, yes, I would give that the edge. I think that the smoke role specifically is really team dependent, and that's maybe a bit of a cop-out. But I think that you get some roles, and yes, I'm going to go by your logic where you remove the IGL aspect of it, because oftentimes IGLs are smokes, but it's not necessarily the fact that they're smokes is what gives them the value, right? But I think that, especially now in this kind of meta where it is more about like, what is your play style? What are your strengths? Like a smoke role could be the most important person on your team, just because like that's how your team thrive. That's how they play. And you still play a very strictly site setup way of playing that we saw in the meta that defined stage 1. You could be a team where that simply is not your way of playing. In Sentinels, am I going to say that their most important role is a smoke role? Hell fucking no, I'm not. I'm not going to say that. But like in other teams, and now I've got to think of a team and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but like in other teams, you may look at them and be like, is a smoke role going to be way more pivotal in the way that they set up their sites and the way that facilitates the way they want to play? Absolutely, it could be. So I think for me, like the smoke role is probably the one that has the power to move up and down the scale the most, dependent on who the team is. Because yes, I would probably also put secondary duelist last, because secondary duelist is a supportive role in the sense that it's like what you might refer to in other games as a flex role, right? So it's kind of like, okay, you fill what you need to do. You may, and yes, a lot of times this is the KO, because the player who may have played the secondary duelist or the second duelist at the end of last year, where you may have had more double duelist compositions, they may have been pushed onto KO this year, whatever. We've seen a lot of players be put in that role. In the stage 1 meta, we saw them take on a lot more of like a very initiator heavy role. So you'd have that sort of double initiator vibe in a lot of teams. But now it's sort of like, okay, well, are you going to play it as a second duelist, or are you going to play it in a more supportive way? There's a lot of flexibility there, and it's sort of like, what does your team need? And in which case that means that the role in and of itself is not as pivotal to be like stringently executed. So it's an important role, but it's the one that has the most movement in it.
Okay.
I can just see people arguing, my favorite player is this. Oh, how dare you say it?
Yeah, by the way, I'll also say
my favorite player is one of those second duelists. My favorite player in all of Valorant is Zeppa, who literally is like quintessentially that role, right? So, yes. And I think he's phenomenal, and I think he had a really, really massive part to play for Cloud9's success at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year. But I think that if you were to look holistically at the scene in and of itself and the way that a lot of teams play, you can't necessarily argue that that is the most valuable role on the team.
Yep.
No, the problem there as well is that's why I purposely said it's supposed to be an open-ended discussion, which, spoiler, it's actually supposed to tell you more about how each person sees the game and the roles than the specific players. Like, so basically, the reason, what you're saying there, Gio, absolutely is what fans will do, but they're confusing the particular for the general, aren't they? In this, like, I'll give you an example. In Counter-Strike, the greatest support player, often like an anchor, is a guy called Zipnix, a Danish player, right? Who's not actually very good now, but he was very good for a long time. The problem is this, that doesn't make his role the best role. It's like you said earlier, the reason why he was amazing is because he had the shittiest role, but made it really good. So as a result, it's like he was like found money. Because basically, the funny thing is Elevated, even though you're not from CSGO, it's actually a fairly similar hierarchy in CSGO. Now, obviously, CSGO doesn't have as rapidly changing metas, and we don't have different characters, so the game sort of retains similar fundamentals. Like, basically, if I take away the role names, I just boil down to what you're talking about, what the player does. Like, spoiler, I can sort of cheat because a lot of the really good in-game leaders in Counter-Strike are the entry player anyway. And it's for exactly the reason you're saying, because what they want to do primarily is the entry, is get all the info and very quickly comm the info to the guys coming in behind them. So they're going to set up their stars. So the one area that Valorant's very different from CSGO is we don't have, like you guys do, where you set up and the duelist can go in first and just kill everyone. You usually actually have the in-game leader go in first, and then the duelist kind of baits him, takes the comms, and then uses that info to kill everyone. So in theory, actually entry would be a very important role in CS because it would just be IGL. Then also, if you put the second best role, it would probably be your star AWPer, like you're saying, because ideally you want your AWPer to be your best player anyway, and similarly to Valorant, it controls the map. It creates like tripwires where you have to cross this guy, and if he doesn't see you, you know they can't be on that side of the map. It's all great info for the IGL. You'll notice this isn't just about what you do when you shoot the guy. It's about what you do the rounds you don't ever see a guy. And then I would probably say third is similar. That is actually where having like a lurker, the reason they are not the most important, but then they'd come in as third, is because they get all the info these other guys drew, and they use all the kills that the guy with the star did, and then they close the round out for you. And if you don't have someone who can close the round out, you could be the best IGL in the world with the best entry players in the world. You're going to lose all the games because you won't win any of the post plants. You won't make use of the advantages you got. So basically, you need to get the info so you can make the right calls and reads. You need someone who uses the info, creates the kills. And you need someone who gets the end of that and just wraps it all up in a night bow. Now, the other roles, as you're talking about, if someone's amazing at that role, maybe they go up in this hierarchy. But the point is, if you were to make a generic team where everyone had identical stats, if you built a team the way you guys are talking about, in the current meta, it sounds like that would be the best team, right?
I mean, maybe like that's the cool thing about a game like Valorant that has so many moving pieces, is that you don't really know what the best approach is yet. You know, like Optic has the best approach because they won Worlds or they won Masters. Do they actually have the best approach? I don't know. They have the best approach at that tournament, but does that mean that they still know what is like the meta going forward? We don't know, and we won't know until the next international event. And you know, coming from a game like Dota where like the meta changes like between every event, basically, I've seen like the cyclical nature of how the game develops, where it's like this thing becomes very important. Everybody focuses on countering that. Then something else becomes important because the thing that was strong is no longer strong because everybody knows how to deal with it. And like we see that happening in Valorant again. Like the times that Optic has lost, it's been because people have been really good at shutting down Yay. They don't do that consistently against Optic, which is why they win a lot. But there are certain times where Yay gets kind of shut down and Optic struggles. And I think we saw that with, like, you know, obviously the Jet nerfs. There was a lot of players who have gone way down in performance because Jet is no longer just like this ubiquitously overpowered character. And we're starting to see that in Chamber, but like there is a cycle that is happening. And I think, like Gio was saying, the smokes role, I would totally agree. In the last stage, I was like, if you have the best smokes player, you're probably going to be the best team because they just had so much impact from a role that's not supposed to have impact.
Yeah, because there's so much of it was relying on site setup. And actually, I just wanted to bring up like an example of a team where I would specifically put their secondary duelist above their AWPer and above their primary duelist is G2, right? Like Nukier is probably one of the biggest value bringers to that team. I know they haven't actually made it through to playoffs in EMEA, but that notwithstanding, he probably was one of the biggest value bringers to the team. The reason that Mixwell has so much value is because of what he does in the comms. And given that we are like kind of like not bringing in the IGL aspect of it into judging these roles, their actual like entry/opping role, I have at least always been not super huge. I always thought that keloqz, when you look at the mechanics and his ability to be a solid Jet, was always better than the way that Mixwell did it. The reason that Mixwell has stayed in the team is because he provides other things to the team. Cool, that's great. But like as an individual, I would argue that Nukier can provide so much more value mechanically and actually the way he plays the game better than Mixwell. Does that mean that all secondary duelists are more valuable than the AWPer? No, it doesn't. But it does mean that G2 don't necessarily fit this sort of archetype that we've built, right?
By the way,
I'd probably include Ghost in that as well. Yeah, sorry to interrupt, because like Ghost is sort of a very interesting team as well. I mean, they do have a very good opper, but I would say that Nismo probably is more impactful in most rounds, and he's sort of like this flex secondary duelist, the raise, the KO, that kind of stuff. I would probably pick Nismo over Koala Noob, like if I was to like start a team based off the impact alone. So it's not like every team fits this, but I definitely think like the whole question was, if I were to start a team to try and get into franchising and I wanted to build the best team possible, what would I sign first? And so
Yeah. Good. And by the way, it's even a classic question, because essentially you can have the same question in every sport, can't you? Like if it's the NFL, do I really need the quarterback best, or do I want like a defensive? But there's a million angles you can go with. Right. One thing you brought up there I thought was a perfect segue, because it's something I wanted to bring up. I alluded to it earlier. Is one of the, I won't even say a hot take, it's just a tweet. You did a tweet that actually sparked an interesting topic, which is you said that you actually think that most teams in pro play, they're too reticent to try the new agents. Like they just sort of, they're sort of in the mindset of like, just stick with the current meta, or they just think, they're just rubbish, aren't they? So like Chamber's a perfect example, because when we started this show was in the last VCT, and that was where actually Chamber was starting to be a relevant force. Like the teams who could play it, you could see some of them became the best teams. Some of those players became much more relevant players, right? You basically said, you think that's like a current example of an agent where actually it's probably already OP. Too many people didn't pick it up, and almost certainly it's just going to get the teleport nerfed, right? So what do you think on that angle? Because when you're saying it like that, as someone who, like I am also in League of Legends, the idea in League of Legends, like someone would just miss for 3 months something was OP and then quickly try and use it before it was nerfed. Like you'd be an idiot in that game, basically. That's actually half the job as a coach, is to get ahead of that. So what do you think on this topic? Because it seems a bit wild.
Yeah, I mean, coming from the MOBA, like whether it's Dota or League of Legends, new pieces being added to this like vast array of options to choose from is always a very confusing thing, because there's so many available pieces that you can use already, and a lot of people are just happy to be comfortable. Like it sucks to go from being the best mid laner on whatever the popular champion is in League of Legends to being like kind of mediocre, because you don't understand how the champion works, and you have to like relearn some of the mechanics, and like your mechanics feel bad and you feel like you're not as good for a little bit, and then you get better at it. But every single time there's been like a new hero introduced into Dota, every single time there's been a new character introduced into Overwatch, it feels like it's like there is potential there for this thing to be insane. And most people are very easy to just like, they go in a couple times, they play it once or twice, it doesn't feel as good as their main agent, and then they go back to that one because they don't like losing, which is fair. But at the same time, you're just kind of like castrating what is possible to develop in that regard. And so every single time that I've seen a new agent, like KO's introduced, I was like, this agent is going to be absolutely insane. It can turn off utility. Like it's so good. It can literally stop Viper from being relevant when Viper is the most important character in the game. And sure enough, I look at the pick rates, KO's like 10%. Next event, KO's 25%. Next event, KO's 40%. It's like very clear that people are slow to pick this stuff up because they're very focused on doing what they do well and trying to perfect that. And I think that's kind of like maybe a CS mindset thing. I don't really know.
I've got a tangent on it. Let's keep going. It's all right.
And so I do think that the teams that have maybe a little bit more like diverse coaching structure, or the teams that have, diverse backgrounds of their players, are probably a little bit more likely to pick up these characters as they come out, and then figure out the abusive mechanics. Because the thing about these character-based games is the devs are going to do a lot of work developing the character, but at the end of the day, they kind of just want to get the character out there and make it fun. And usually, most of the time, a character gets released a little bit overpowered. That's just kind of how it goes.
That's also just the Riot way, by the way. It's just the Riot Games way.
You want people to buy the character.
Yeah, exactly.
To buy the character's cosmetics, and you want it to be fun. And the most fun way to play a character is to win the game. And so usually they come out kind of broken. Chamber's another good example. It's like, oh, look, another instant teleport. That can't be broken. Oh, wait, it absolutely is. And he has the best weapon in the game. And he literally has a Guardian for 800 credits. That seems pretty overpowered. Fade comes out, same kind of thing. It's like, okay, this character can literally find out exactly where people are and wall hack, and you can combo with another wall hack from Sova, and suddenly nobody can hide. Same thing with Astra. Okay, this character can stop any rush instantly from anywhere on the map. It's like, there's a very clear pattern here. And I think that the teams that are like, and I know I'm kind of like tangentially going off here, but
it's all right, I'll bring it back. Keep going.
But I understand from a competitive perspective why teams don't pick up these things, because if you're doing something that's working, why would you change?
Yes,
right?
If it's broke, don't fix it. Yeah, it's that vibe, right? Yes.
Especially if you're a salaried player that is worried, about your results. Like, you don't necessarily want to lose 10 games in a row because you're trying something new when your job depends on winning the game. And so players are incentivized not to change if they're doing stuff that's working well, or they're incentivized to copy the best teams because those teams have clearly figured it out. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are giving up a huge amount of equity in the game by not experimenting and not doing weird stuff, whether it's in scrims or pracs or the smaller tournaments, and just being okay looking like complete garbage for a while and then coming up with stuff that either does or doesn't work.
Sure.
Okay, so here's my take on that, because I think something that you brought up that I think actually highlights a difference here is you brought up League of Legends as an example. So let's take the beginning of this year, right? League of Legends, I mean, especially off the back of Arcane being released, it was like, okay, mid lane, you're always going to see a Victor. ADC, you're always going to see a Jinx, right? Stuff like that, right? But here's the thing. You don't play Jinx in the mid lane. You don't play Jinx in the top lane. You don't play Jinx as a support. You don't play Victor in the bot lane, right? So whereas in Valorant, you can do all of those things.
Right.
It's like, so when KO came out, and I've beaten this over the head so many times, but I will never shut up about it. When KO came out, originally everyone thought the best way to play KO was going to be as a second duelist. Mm-hmm. And actually what ended up happening was when teams tried that out in stage 3 last year, it didn't work. What happened was Cloud9 popularized the way of playing KO as a second initiator, and that worked, and people started to pick that up. Now, according to the roles within the game, that is not, I mean, KO I know is technically an initiator, but according to the roles within the game, you are crossing between those. In League of Legends, you do not see that except exceptionally rarely, and usually after a rework of a champion, right? So it's usually there is a very strict idea of where this champion is going to fit in the game. In Valorant, that simply isn't the case. So what I think we've seen in a lot of instances is there have been some teams who are reluctant to just go into a character. I totally get that, and the statistics about pick rate don't lie, right? Numbers don't lie. But there are teams who try things out in a certain expected role, and what ends up happening is when that character ends up actually becoming a good pick to be played is not necessarily in the role that people advertised it as in the beginning. For example, Chamber, he's a Sentinel. Now, yes, does his ability or does his kit allow him to play as a Sentinel? Yeah, his trademarks are a Sentinel way of playing. Do people typically put him on the Sentinel player and play him as a Sentinel? No, they don't. They usually play him as an Opper. So you have way more flexibility to kind of go between the lines of what those roles are within Valorant than you do in something like League of Legends. And I would assume Dota, but I don't know Dota, so I'm not going to...
Dota's actually, interestingly, that's the difference. Over the place. Dota's more really? Like you're saying about... It's actually probably the most extreme game where you can play
I've never played it.
You can play any hero in any role if you're good enough at the hero. The second part's the key part, though. So, for example, I'm not an expert about Dota, but I have watched it a lot. Basically, Elevated, one thing I've always loved is when you see people who they're just so amazing at a carry champion. They play in the 4 position or something because they're just going to min-max the fucking use no resources, but just maybe then
put that in League of Legends.
That's like a supportive. That's like the support of the jungler. The jungler maybe. Yeah. So basically, in that scenario, it's maybe they're just absurdly good with the ult or the revive or the CC6. So it's quite similar, right? Elevated. I think it sounds like it has more of a Valorant vibe, right? You can just
Yeah, absolutely. So in that example, and I know there's probably people just tuning out because we're talking about Dota in a Valorant podcast.
It's all good. Don't worry about
it. One thing that you're mentioning is each piece of utility that a character has, whether it's, in Valorant or Dota, is a resource that you can use, right? And so sometimes the ultimate is really good at killing stuff, but it's also really good at CC. And so you can take that hero from being a kill hero into a CC hero and still have, then a different hero take the carry role. And in Valorant, I think it's kind of the same thing where it's you could have KO run in with his ultimate like a Phoenix, which is kind of what people were thinking. And I'll be honest, I thought that was what he was going to do also. Yeah. Or you could have him literally be like the anchor sometimes because people are trying to hit the site and you just pop your ultimate and then they kill you, but you're still on site watching people and turning off all of their utility. And so that's like an entirely different role for a character that is seen as an aggressive character, but could also be very defensive minded as well. But the point being is that I don't think you find out about these things unless you grind the character.
Yes.
And so that's the really important thing that people need to do is as soon as a new character comes out, you have to just grind it because you're going to find weird little abuses, weird little things, weird little interactions that you won't know otherwise. You know, like Fade comes out, people are like, this character sucks. I saw a lot of people say that Fade is like, she's kind of mid. And then you see a team run a Fade with a Brimstone and a Raze, and you're like, oh my God, this is absolutely broken. And so it's like, it changes so quickly once people actually figure out a few little tricks of like how things work.
I think there are definitely examples on the other side. And this is where I think the really important thing is, okay, so yes, I do think that if you're a professional team, it is important that you understand every character so that you have the flexibility to play all of them. You need to understand the interactions between them, because even if you choose not to play that character, you need to understand how to counter them, right? Like, especially as more characters come into the game, that's not going to slow you down. You need to understand that. But it's also important that you understand where your strengths are. And I think a team who are an example of this right now is the Guard, who tried very hard to adapt to this like new meta at the beginning of this stage. And it simply did not necessarily work to their strengths, right? And so it's also about like, yes, they've embraced that, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that they, presumably they practiced a lot of, these new Fade, especially at the beginning of the stage, whatever, and this new way of playing, but also being able to recognize when your strengths don't necessarily have to fit the meta, and that's okay, as long as you can utilize and harness those strengths in a way that does counter people who are playing to the meta. And I think that's a big problem that the Guard had this stage, right? Is like, they were a little bit slow at the beginning. They probably could have made, it's a shoulda, woulda, coulda thing, but like, they probably could have made playoffs if they did just be like, this is our game, this is how we play our game, rather than trying too much to fit into what they thought the game was. And so there's definitely a balance to be had between the two polarized opposites.
Right. I think one thing that's worth noting there, though, is like, did they switch their roles and try new agents because they liked the new agent, or did they do it because everybody else was doing it? And that's kind of like the point that I was trying to make, where it's like a lot of teams are innovators and a lot of teams are following the innovation. And if you are the innovator, I think you have a huge advantage, which is where it's important to like try the new stuff out and figure out what's going on. But the teams that are then trying to copy what the innovators are doing generally are going to be at a disadvantage because they're just doing it because it looks like it's working,
And sometimes I've found, because this is a very famous thing in League of Legends, by the way, that like NA teams, probably the worst of the four major regions, try to copy things that the Korean teams do. And the premise goes, even if you copy it, you might not understand why it works. You might not know what, you didn't invent the mechanism, as it were. You're just looking and trying to take the surface level of what they do. So you might even not be applying it correctly, Yeah,
you have to understand the why in order to actually be able to perform. Hey, that's one thing I definitely learned in my degree.
Write that down, someone. That's a good line. Okay.
There's me, like, I did a degree that's completely not related to esports, but that's definitely one thing that came up in my degree. So if I paid that amount of money for anything, let it be that.
There you go.
Oh, by the way, to wind it back, Elevated, when you said earlier, because obviously the topic was about teams not being that, like, not actually trying to jump on the new trend and get the fastest to the new info, instead, almost like, I'll use my own phrasing here, it feels to me like they were like, right, I'll wait for someone else to prove to me what it does. Oh, now it's amazing. Yeah, now let's pick it up. But as you say, you might be picking up with them, by the way, midway through the life cycle, or God forbid at the end, and it's about to be nerfed, you idiot. Like, you waste all your time. Because one thing I will say is this: since there's so many CSGO pro players in Valorant, I do wonder actually if that's part of, like, just mentally what is stopping some of these people essentially picking it up as you would in a MOBA. You dive on that stuff immediately to get the edge, because I can tell you in CSGO, you have to remember a fundamental difference difference, and I'll reiterate this again because people will forget this. A key difference between CSGO and Valorant is because every character is the same in CSGO, the only variable in CSGO is the map. So what we veto, like you guys, but this is the problem, we veto the map. So I'll tell you, for example, when a new map comes out in CSGO, mostly it isn't the top teams that pick it up. Usually they already have 5 or 6 maps. So what they do is they just make that their ban and they stay as the top team. But because they can ban it, that's okay as long as they have a strong map pool. The problem you're going to have in Valorant is that mentality won't work because the agent, you can't ban the agent. It's not League of Legends either. So if the agent is really good, you are going to have to play against it. You're probably going to have to use it. And unfortunately, in this scenario, the only analogy I can give that would be similar in CSGO, and this is why it's a bad sign, is the only thing that does sometimes change in CSGO to be OP is the weapons. Maybe they balance the weapon differently. And I can tell you, there's a really bad track record of people taking a while to figure out that something's OP that got changed. The same thing. Like we had a player who's one of the best rifle players in the world who refused to use the Krieg, which is the most overpowered T weapon, even though he was the best rifler, because his logic genuinely was, I'm sure it'll just get nerfed since it's OP. And he just didn't use it the whole time. And by the way, for real, definitely left loads of potential championships on the table, wasn't the number one player. Like, it was really silly. Like, he would have absolutely dominated with this weapon. So that makes me worry, actually, that CSGO players, because we're used to it, much more of like a stale, very gradually moving meta, I think a lot of them are going to be in the mindset, like, look, if this got me this far, I'm fine with it like it is. But it sounds like Valorant, as we were saying, each VTT cycle could be different.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I've been on record kind of criticizing, like, I feel a little bit bad because I don't have the context of being a longtime CS follower, but I've seen the teams that have more CS players be less likely to adapt. And on that point, I also do have to give credit to Optic because I was pretty critical of them as being kind of a boring team to watch because I thought they were very CSGO minded for a long time and they were just kind of like
and then Neon happened.
The set
what
stuff. Happened? and then they got cringe comped and then they started extremely innovative. And now they're one of my favorite teams to watch because they're doing cool stuff all the time.
Wait, hold on. So you think they only got innovative after the last Masters?
I mean, to some extent, like they were.
But they invented the whole neon thing on fucking Haven or whatever the fuck back in stage 1. They were at least doing that.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking more about the time where they would like lose to Sentinels constantly. It's like in the earlier stages, the whole part where they weren't the best team in North America. Right. It's like they were always there, and then they would, it just kind of felt like they didn't have like the spice, and now they definitely have the spice, and everybody else is copying them because they're doing the cool stuff. They're playing the Neon, the Yoru. They're having Ye play like entry chamber, and so the shift that they've made from being sort of like a very static team to being a very, very like almost chaotic team, but still with the Optic structure has made them insanely hard to prep for and very, very hard to play against.
I think that the popularization of chamber and sort of the understanding that there's pretty much always going to be a chamber because he's such a powerful agent has allowed Optic the freedom to be more flexible because they always know they have Ye.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean? It's like they always know he's there. So like even when they were doing the whole fucking Victor on Neon shit and like whatever, and like he was being like this hyper entry who wouldn't always win those like opening whatever, but he was trying to gain space. It was like, yeah, but we know we have Ye on this role that has just come into the game that was basically built for Ye. Do you know what I mean? So, and that gives a lot of freedom and flexibility, which yes, we maybe didn't see as much last year. And it would be wrong to insinuate that they were an unsuccessful team last year because they came second at Masters Berlin. I should really know this. I worked the fucking event, but like they came second at something.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure it was Masters.
To be fair, if fans don't know, when you're on camera, especially when you're already recording, your brain sort of locks off some of your memories. It's not as easy. Like at home, you're all going, oh, it's obviously that. Like you wouldn't remember it yourself if you're on the show.
I'm like, oh my God, because there was another event after that. It was Champions, and I'm like, wait, hold on. And as soon as you start to doubt that the seeds have been planted, you're like, fuck, I don't know.
You got to just go with it and hope you're right. You got to go with it and hope you're right. Yeah.
But like, so they definitely weren't an unsuccessful team last year, and they were like, especially after they picked up Marv, which was just before Masters Berlin, they got him on loan from FaZe. That is when you started to see them work together really well as a squad. But I think that coming into 2021, like having that role suddenly sort of enter into this inception, because yes, okay, sure, Chamber is a sentinel, but he's not. He's like Sage. It's like Sage is her own role. The role is Sage. He enters into this and it's like, right, we can trial this shit because we know that Ye is in this spot where like we kind of have that backup. If we need a backup, he might not even be the backup. He might be the guy who's doing all the work in the round. But like, if everything goes wrong, he's there. You know what I mean?
That's interesting that you say, by the way, that it was like Marv coming in that like fixed the team. I guess it's true what they say. He can really fix anything. Anyway, keep going. Sorry, that was weird. What was that sort of... I know,
who said that?
What was that? Cut that out, editor. No, keep going. What do you think?
Where were we? I think that
I've got a good segue, actually. I've got a good one for you, because here's another topic you had, unless you had a key point here. Did you have a good point?
I just wanted to clarify that I don't think you have to innovate to be a good team. And so that was like Optic was winning because their execution was elite. They were a good team because they were elite executors. But I think the one thing that held them back from like winning champs or winning Masters Berlin is that they didn't have that like extra wrinkle on their game, which was like, you know, the secret set play or like the weird comp that came out. Is like they were way better than almost every other team at like hitting a site, defaulting, like host plants, trading, that kind of stuff. But there is that extra thing in Valorant where it's like fundamentals are not everything and you have to have something else.
Yeah. And they did have that coaching change, of course, as well, like after Masters Berlin. So yeah, that's definitely a part to play.
I've got a good segue for you, because this is another topic I saw you said on Twitter. It's a great topic starter. You also said, I'll just read the quote. You said, it's starting to feel like NA VCT teams are going to need to mess with their map pools a bit. I swear it feels like everyone is getting clowned on their map picks. Now, obviously, again, this is has some crossover to CSGO. So I want to know, what did he mean by that? Because obviously at the moment, loads of teams have lost their map pick, right? In fact, it's even why half the bloody the subreddit's just like coach of team, like, please stop saying my team is bad on that map. That's like every single interview, isn't it? So go on then, what would you expand on this a bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's just something that I saw from watching, because I watch basically every single match. And I was like, I was looking up at the corner. I'm like, that can't be right, because they're down like 3-12 on their map pick. Like, how is this happening every single time I tune in? But I mean, it makes sense. You have a week to prep. You know they're going to pick this map. I think a lot of it came down to these teams are still kind of like developing their new rosters. They're putting things together. And so they're scrimming people on the maps, and they develop like, you know, a 3 or 4 map pool with like 1 or 2 that are clearly the strong ones. And so it becomes very easy to prep against them. And because of that, you know, obviously, if the other team knows where you are all the time, it's very hard to play the game. So I feel like I'm one of those people that kind of looks at like what is the ceiling of the strategy of the game, whether it's practical to do that or not. You know, maybe you only have the ideal for 3
scenario,
maps, and that's fine. And if you only have protocols on 3 maps, then just pick those 3 maps. But if you can reach for that next level of having, you know, maybe your permanent ban is actually pretty good, or you have this other 3rd map that you can throw in, or 4th map that you can throw in, so that if the team is expecting you to pick Ascent because you've won 17 straight Ascent games, then all of a sudden you just like pick Split, or you pick like Breeze or something like that. People are like, wait, what is this? How do we ban against this next? What is our next thing? And suddenly you get like 3 maps that are really good for you. And the other team has to throw out like, you know, 20 pages of prep work or something like that.
Yes.
I mean, I also think like, you simply can't, you know, I think the Valorant's in this kind of like puberty right now, where it's like, okay, a lot of these teams have sort of developed this identity on like, this is the maps we like to play, these are the maps we don't, these are the agents we like to play, or whatever. And it's like, there are going to be new maps that continue to come out. You are past the point, and I've cited this before as, you know, when Fracture came out, teams had to start deciding what they were going to ban out of Breeze and Fracture, because they could not have both as a ban. Like, they just couldn't do it. And I think that was the first turning point at which a lot of teams had to start expanding their map pool, because when Breeze came out, it was like, okay, well, you can just permaban it because it's fine. You've got all the other shit over there. That is not going to be an option anymore. Like, you have to expand your map pool, otherwise you will drop off because other people will do it. Like, you can't ban enough maps to make up for the new maps that come out. And then I think also, yeah, with these, like, the changes in meta and the flexibility that the game affords, is like the way that certain maps are played are also going to be different. So you may have always permabanned, I don't know, fucking Haven, but it's like the way that Haven is ideally played, or like the kind of compositions that you want to play right now may be different to the reasons that made you want to permaban Haven in the first place in the last however many months or whatever. And so, you know, I definitely think that sure, if you're in a point like in the immediate present where you can only play X, Y, and Z map, like, yes, you have to play to your strengths. I think it's very important that teams play to their strengths, especially when it comes to important games and officials. But it's like, these teams have to be able to expand that, because wherever the map pool gets, whether it gets to a point that's like they only bring out a certain number of maps and that's it, they stop, or if it's something like, you know, for example, in Rainbow Six, there are however many maps, but the competitive map pool is capped at X number of maps, right? So it's like you always know how many maps you have as an option. Whatever it may be that is in Valorant, you have to be prepared for that, because if you're unprepared, there will be a team that is prepared. But because there's so much that comes into it, like, yes, there are no agent bans, at least as of yet, and stuff like that, and new agents are coming out, and the way that you play them is changing, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, what you may have developed as your identity for the map you don't like to play, or the maps you don't like to play, that might not actually continue to be true, and you have to constantly be evolving in that, because there will be other teams that are doing that. And I think that's the thing with seeing a lot of teams like losing their map picks is it's like, okay, Team X may have always been great at Icebox, but it's like, okay, great, Icebox got changed. The agents that we're playing on Icebox are different. Like, you may have always been great at Icebox, but like, we're playing it better right now given the circumstances of the game and the environment of the game, right? I also just think it's a really good thing that just shows like learning and growth from all of these teams, to the point where like you are seeing the teams that are in the same league and in the tier 1 league of the game sitting at a very similar point in like their overall average performance. And so being able to take maps off of each other. And I think that's a very important part of this game, because it actually starts to show that separation out of like, okay, these are the teams that can compete with each other. This is the next level of teams that can compete with each other, etc. And you start to get this idea of what the scene actually looks like, which again, yeah, I think all falls under that umbrella of like, it's the puberty of the game.
That's why, actually, since essentially we have the exact, and it's obviously copied off CSGO, like Valorant the game, obviously we have the exact same map pool size, we have the same Veto system. I can actually tell you there will be a lot of nuance that maybe the CSGO pros know and their coaches and IGLs, but a lot of casuals aren't going to know how much complexity there is as to what you can do in the Veto. They're all going to think naively, right, you Veto your worst map or their best map, and then you just pick yours with the highest win rate. Not at all. Like, I'll give you a few examples. Some of them I've mentioned on past shows. I won't make it too long. Like, first of all, if you always go to your home map and it really is your best map, that's super predictable. I'm just going to prep your best map only. I'm not going to waste my time prepping 4 maps. Prep your best map. And if you're winning on it, as fucked up as this sounds, you're also giving me a blueprint of what to shut down and how to stop you. And the one problem that's a very common problem, it's like the thing about the agents, is when you are the best team on a map, naively, you tend to just repeat what you did before, iterate again, and it's only when people beat you, you go, right, shit, better update this. It's why, if you get the rare teams, it sounds like maybe the Gambit squad was like this in Valorant. If you get the rare teams that really are like geniuses at the game, they update before you even beat them. So that's why you can't fucking get to them. Then there's the other angle, right? Like you said, a massive bonus elevated if you can go away from your home pick is they just wasted like 10 hours looking at fucking VODs for that. That ain't going to help them on this next map. Then there's another angle, this is a good one, which is, this is a really misunderstood one, which is if you both end up having the same permaban in a Veto, if you occasionally play it, you have an insane advantage. You can either not veto it and float it and gamble that he's going to float it, which can never get played, or he has to waste his perma on your permaban. So the problem with that, though, is he's not going to do that, or if he goes first, he's going to know you're going to have to be the one who loses in perma chicken if you never play it. So what I would suggest you do, by the way, quick pro tip, is if you're like a top 10 team in your region, just play it against the teams that are like 35th ranked or whatever. Just show some examples of you playing it. Spoiler, you're going to be so much more skilled, you're going to win a bunch of these games anyway, but you've got to at least like make the other team respect that they will have to do the chick, because anytime that happens, by the way, that's a rare example, but when it happens in a match, whoever gets to either go second or is forced to be the one who doesn't have to perma it gets an insane advantage in the Veto. They just get one extra map basically. So that, think about the edge you'd get if you were two equally balanced teams. And then the last one, there's one last one that goes like this, which is if you you in your map pool have maps that, look, you're not strong on it, but you're willing to play. It's on the fringes of your map pool. It means now that you can do stuff like when you play against a team who is just bad on that map, if they're enough below you in like raw level, you can just play at that time. You don't have to play your home map. So these are all areas where like, it's absolutely, I know the problem with this is because it's the beginning, you haven't played the game yet. People think it's just easy. It's like an ABC thing, just paint by numbers in the Veto. The Veto has so much depth, people don't get it. Like, I actually think if you're a coach IGL, people don't know. People have 3-hour discussions about this shit, about what they should veto and what they might do here and why should we. Like, it's actually a fascinating topic if people don't know. There's definitely a lot of depth you can explore in Valorant, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think kind of like the thing that you were talking about at the beginning is like you just pick this map if you're good at it and you ban this map if you're bad at it. I feel like that's kind of what was happening in the first few weeks of
Understandably, yes.
Yeah, which makes sense. But I agree that like the amount of complexity just in the map drafting part is like insane and totally not realized yet.
For sure. Also, I will just say as well, as a brief other point, I don't think, like, look, as Gio says, in same with the agents, ideally you'd want to play all the maps, wouldn't you? You'd want to just play everything and then you'd have the choice of what to do. The reality is, obviously, you have limited amount of time, you have matches that are coming up, you also just, let's be real, unless you have 5 perfect players, you're just not going to be equally good on all the maps. So I will say, by default, the better the team is, it's normally going to have a larger map pool. So once you get, like, say, out of the top 10, the top 20, yeah, those are teams that probably have 2 maps they're good on, 3 maps they're good on. But these are the teams, again, where if they naively think, well, we're only good on these maps, they're going to have no veto power whatsoever. You've always got to have something. It's like in sports, the way you say it, you'll appreciate this, Elvin. You say you've got to keep the defense honest. You've got to do things that aren't necessarily your primary go-to move. Otherwise, they eliminate that from what they have to defend, and it becomes easier to defend your best move. Like, essentially, if people don't know, like a random aside, if people don't know, here's the best example ever in sports. What is Michael Jordan's signature move? It's a turnaround, fading baseline jump shot. You have to understand, that's the counter to everyone stopping him going to the basket for the first 10 years of his career. That's why he was the best player ever, because the counter to what you do to his best move then became his next best move. Like, you can't beat someone who has that. So even if you're a smaller team, for real, the hours you put in on a niche map, they won't pay dividends immediately, but there'll be that one key match where you'll get a veto edge. There'll be an opponent better than you who's bad on that map, and suddenly you have like a chance in a series that if you did, essentially, the reason why you don't do what you said, Elevated, at the beginning, just agree to play the best maps, is because then you get silly series where you both handshake. Let's just both play the maps we're good at. Well, if they're better than you, that's just an invitation to lose the game, isn't it?
Boring as well.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of what happened with Zeta, honestly, at Champions. I think that's kind of what happened with Zeta, because they came in with a fracture comp that nobody was running. They rolled back the clock and were playing this like Astra Viper slow, like molasses comp. And people were like, Fracture is kind of a weird map. I guess you just play Raze. You kind of just like burst onto sites. And then Zeta's out there just like, you can't enter the site and you can't stop us from entering the site because we have way more control of the map than you do. And suddenly everybody's losing to this Japanese team on this map that everybody thought was going to be like pretty straightforward. And that's how you get a crazy run like they had.
It's like, Duncan, I don't know if you would agree with putting it this way, but like as a desk analyst, I want to be wrong in the map veto prediction I make.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, I want that to be wrong. I want it to be
as spicy as possible. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Pull out the shit. I can't even predict you're going to, they probably won't play this. That's the shit when they do.
I remember, like, for Masters Berlin, which was obviously September last year, so it's been a while now, but like, sitting and being like, okay, here's my matchup that I have today. Like, what am I going to put as, what maps do I think is going to happen? It's like, oh, well, this team the entire event have banned this map, and this team the entire event have banned this map. Oh, I wonder if they're going to ban these 2 maps. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you want them to not be that legible. You don't want them to be that predictable. And that is, while it's also great if, like, as, the analyst, I'm proven wrong and they do something that I didn't expect, that's good for entertainment factor. But also, like, it's great because it shows a level of depth to the team that I am simply not privy to as a third party. And that is what we want to see. I want to see the results of that depth.
And by the way, I'll give you a quick aside. obviously, because I said, like in CSGO, it's quite similar. Like people just stick with what they're the best at. Usually it's true if you are the best team in CSGO, because you're just the best on the other 6 maps and probably have the best players, you do stick to a permaban. But I can tell you, there is always a team, they're usually like, let's say, 10th best team. And if they're a team that actually embrace, we won't have a perma, as in we will cycle the perma based on the opponent. That is an insane way to jump levels in the game, by the way, because that way you can always create a matchup that's potentially not necessarily favourable, but not as disfavourable, for example, when you're playing better teams. If you can do that, it's a lot of hard work. That's why I say the number 1 team doesn't usually do it. That's how you go from being like the 20th best team to the 10th without changing anything about the team.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, like you were saying about the analysts, like if I, as a desk analyst, can predict what you're going to do, I am 100% certain that the other team can predict what's going to happen.
Like, this is I know a lot of people have a lot to say about like what analysts should and shouldn't be able to do on broadcast, but it's like, I need to be the dumb shit in this scenario. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I'm the outsider making judgments based on things that you have shown to the public. I need to be the one who's being like the dumbass. Like, you need to be proving me wrong and outsmarting me and being one step ahead of what I can predict, because I'm not, I don't want to say I'm not qualified, but it's like, I'm sat there watching the game just like everybody else and making judgments based on that. And if I can read into what you're doing it wrong.
Well, if it's any consolation, I always think you're the dumbass on the desk chair.
I appreciate that.
You've done an amazing job with that.
You've always been such a great support ever since the day I met you.
I agree, though, by the way. I'll even extend it further, just as a brief point about analysis. I actually also, by the way, hate it when you make really good analysis based on what teams do, and then they play completely differently, and fans are like, you didn't say that. It's like, I'm glad they didn't play that way. I want to see something, a new match. By the way, I also want the opponent to adapt to what they did. It shouldn't be the same match I'm playing out of my head. For fuck's sake.
It's like, here's the expectation that I, as a total fucking rando, have been able to take from the way they're playing. I want their opponent to be at least one step ahead of that and play smarter. And I want them to have recognized that too, because if I, as the rando, am picking that out, then this is not the most dimensional version of this game that we could be watching. I don't care if I'm right or wrong. I care if we're having a good game. And if I'm right, it's probably not the best game that we could be having.
Yes. By the way, I thought one thing we could do is, I've got one last topic I want to hit on. It's actually another team-related one. We're going to come out with the abstract now, guys, back into the reality of the everyday world and fucking sunrises and sets. Or does it? Ooh, check out some YouTube videos. Right? So here's the question. That's just fucking pointless, edgy fucking thing for the algorithm, innit? Right? Here's the question elevated, right? It goes like this. The actual team I'm going to ask about is one we haven't talked about that much on this show because of the reason I'm going to ask about them. It's actually XSET. Because, mate, I'm getting a vibe about these. Are these guys fucking onliners or something? They're so good in these VCT fucking tournament, and they never go to the land, do they? Like, what? Like, every time they're sort of just in position where they're almost like, oh, they should almost be a favourite here. Wow, they're like winning all these. What's going on with this squad elevated? Because they've had the core a while now.
I mean, I don't know how to put this without sounding kind of mean, but I think XSET are pretty boring. I think they're kind of a boring team. And I think they're literally like Optic from like what I was talking about, 18 months ago.
Without the spice.
Yeah, they're a very good, well-drilled team. They have extremely good executes. They have firepower. They have nice, trading, teamwork fundamentals. But you kind of know what you're getting every time you play against them, I feel like. And that is just something that's not going to give you what you need to make it through a bracket that only has 2 people going to an international LAN, or 2 teams, rather. And I think that maybe this exit that we're seeing now is probably about the best that we've seen from them, but I still am not convinced that it's enough because they just don't really have like this spark factor that I've seen that separates them from, even a team like Evil Geniuses. Like EG, probably a worse team than XSET, like 80-90% of the time, but I would still say EG's peaks are higher than XSET's peaks because they will do some weird stuff and like hyper prep for a team and come out with like a strategy that just works on a specific day. So I would say like if you're XSET and you're like they're like the ETF. They're like a mutual fund. You invest in XSET if you want like a very steady return.
Right. Okay.
But if you're trying to go to the moon, you're gonna put your money in like
XSET's the S&P 500.
There you go.
Like AMC? Was that what people started doing?
Yeah.
GMC or whatever. Yeah, but I think so. Yeah.
Exactly.
Oh my Christ.
True.
That's a good way of putting it there. It's like with XSET, I was never like super invested in them. I always thought Cryo was quite fun to watch. Def, you know, he's a Brit, so shout out. But like Def is like relatively old for like an esports player. He's in his 30s. Oh. But I know, right?
What does that feel like?
I wouldn't know. But he you know, I think when you have like kind of that older voice being the leadership in a team, like there's gonna be kind of more stability. I always thought Aaron was a really interesting player to watch as well, because he was always a player who to me like would have some moments where it's like, oh my god, you look so good, and then some moments where I was like, what the fuck are you doing? But I definitely agree with you in the case of like them not necessarily being spicy enough. And I think the big concern with teams like that in general, just to generalize it a little bit beyond the XSET, is that when you get to playoffs, there will be teams who are maybe a little bit below you in standings, but a little bit spicier than you, as you put it, who are going to have like extra shit up their sleeve specifically for playoffs. And it's like you worry about these teams that are very stable and very proper about like what extra do you have to give, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, so XSET, they have a bye into the second round of the upper bracket. They're going to go against the winner of FaZe Clan and 100T's. And both of those are teams where I can, like, if you go against FaZe Clan, great. Like, what's Baby Bay going to, like, throw in your face? If you go against 100T's, we've already spoken about that team and what it is they could potentially bring. If you're being very conservative, yes, are the peaks? It's like your average may be higher in terms of, like, just consistent value, performance, whatever. But what are the peaks that are going to get, like, actually get you the one up over them when it matters? And that's, yeah, a concern, I guess.
Like, for example, I'm just looking at their stats right now, and they have like 4 maps that they consistently win on, and a permanent ban, and then a couple maps that they're kind of mediocre on. And every single map has a single comp that they've played, like in the last like 3 months. They play like the same comps, they do the same thing. There's like very little innovation as far as like kind of the...
Is that extreme compared to their peers?
I would say so. I mean, Optic are kind of an outlier, but they've played, you know, a million different comps on every different map. And I still feel like, I don't know, maybe it's not even the comps. It's just like the way that they approach the round. Everything about XSET feels kind of static.
Sounds like a bit cookie cutter, right? They're just doing things.
It's just a little
same way,
static,
simple.
yeah.
Right, okay.
I would love it if they just like come into the playoffs and they just throw their fucking comps out the window and they've just like got something completely new that's like unearthed. I'd be like, holy shit, this is a show.
Geo,
yeah,
but then you lose your investment. Then you're invested in GameStop or AMC
oh, no,
with no money.
my stable lifelong fund that I was investing in. No, you're so right. And it's also interesting as well because like XSET still, you know, play agents that you would kind of look at a little. I mean, Astra is obviously the main one, right? Like a lot of teams have let go of Astra. And you know, an agent being antiquated is not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that's important to remember because like we were talking about before, you have to understand what your strengths are and not necessarily just play to the tune of the meta because it's the meta, right? And I think that like that's great. And there are definitely maps where we do see some teams still play people like Astra on. You still see Viper come up. I mean, Viper's obviously not has not been let go of as much as Astra necessarily has. And yeah, even just looking at their stats myself, it's like the last time they played Ascent, they brought on Reyna. Well, how many teams are playing Reyna on Ascent, right? Like for a lot of teams for a long time, it's like you may have seen Reyna on Icebox, but like that's still fresh compared to some other ideas that they may have had. So maybe they do have things like up their sleeve and maybe they do have like innovation ready to come out. It's just about like we haven't seen XSET in that spot where we're talking about them as the top team or as like a potential LAN you know, attender of a team. So we haven't necessarily seen like the real peak of what they can do and how they can prove that they are still like that top thing with that spark in North America. We're always talking about teams, you know, teams like Optic, like Cloud9, who obviously haven't made it into playoffs, but like that's another team that did show that spark and did prove that they had something a little bit extra to give when it really mattered.
Yeah, it's kind of weird just like thinking about how their games go. It's usually like they get a lead and then they just kind of like grind their lead to a victory. It just doesn't really feel like there is so much room for them to just pull something out of their ass. It's like you don't see that as much. You'll like have these other teams who are behind, and then they'll come back from 20 like 10 rounds down and do some weird stuff, and they're kind of like scrapping their way through the game. The XSET feels a little bit less scrappy, a little bit like if things are not going well, it's just probably going to slowly trend to a loss. I don't know.
I was just going to jump in and say the interesting thing about XSET as well is that in Group A, which is the group that they won to get their bye in playoffs, they're actually third in the group for round differential.
Oh, weird.
They're not, okay. Yeah, right? So they have a plus 17 round differential, and then goes to plus 36, so double that, and 100 Thieves are plus 22. So they're actually behind both of those teams on round differential, despite coming top of the group.
Yeah, I'm actually curious about their maps as well. Like, I guess they had some pretty close games against the Guard, but against 100 Thieves, they got kind of blown out. I don't know what that really says about them, but the round differential, it's like they're kind of just like in the middle, just like we've been talking about with their peaks. Ghost is blowing teams out, but also losing occasionally. 100 Thieves blowing teams out, also losing occasionally. XSET, it's like we're doing our job, and
Group A is
doing
very
it well.
Polarized, because after you have their plus 17 round differential, the next one down is TSM with minus 18. Mm-hmm. So, that's a 35 point difference or 35 round difference between third and fourth. Whereas you look over at Group B, Luminosity have a minus 5 round differential and Cloud9 have a plus 2 differential, right? So the
Please
difference
don't look at
is there. We
won't talk about that.
Minus 48 round differential, but I just mean in the middle of the group, it's a way less diametrically opposed than what we see in that Group A. So I mean that in and of itself just kind of says more about the group than anything. But the fact that XSET have managed to come out top of the group, but when you actually get into the nitty gritty of where have they put their rounds on the board, they actually still haven't overcome Ghost and 100 Thieves, one of whom they may end up having to face, dependent on 100 Thieves' performance in the first round.
This episode was kindly supported by Ahmed Hadjou, Matt Pugnatio, Rajcula, Kyle R, Travis Goff, Adam Ochs, Animosity, Butt Pounder 420, Hades, Jensen Goh, Joseph Ginsburg, Kovacevicd, Pacy, Tobias Bernasconi, Tosh, Thooorin, Zoomba, Zyrathenia, and as always, special thanks goes out to my boy Jerky's Minion. Want to suggest a topic or a guest? Would you like to ask a question in one of those AMAs I do? Maybe you want to find out who the upcoming guests are for my interviews, or you'd like to be part of one of those long discussions with yours truly. Well, if any of these perks appeal to you or others, check out the description box link below to Patreon and put your money where your mouth is and join the Illuminati today.